Funding for this program is brought to you by Bismarck Big Boy. From pizza burgers flying style to fast and delicious fried chicken, Bismarck Big Boy has been a local legend since 1954.
In the steakhouse or in the bar, one of these oil guys flipped over the placemat and did a lease that valued about almost $500,000 and had it notarized and everything on this placemat right in the GP.
John Lewis Peterson arrived in Bismarck in 1881 and opened the Pacific Hotel, named in honor of the Northern Pacific Railroad that ran through the city, and died only a few short years after its opening. His widow married Henry Tatley, and they continued to run the hotel, remodeling many times over the years and renaming it to the Grand Pacific Hotel. After their stepfather retired in 1924, brothers John Jr. and Frederick Peterson purchased and ran the Grand Pacific, along with other Bismarck hotels, until cousins John and Vernon Peterson closed the hotel in 1974.
The Grand Pacific Hotel was started by my great-grandfather, Lewis Peterson, and he homesteaded initially north of Detroit Lakes at Homestead. After a couple years, moved to Bismarck, and he was a bricklayer by trade. But he realized that was the railroad ended there, and there was opportunity there. It was kind of a little boom town going with the steamboats and everything, and so it started from there, and it was very successful at that time. In fact, he started a stage line between Bismarck and Washburn for mail, and then that was with John Sutherland, and actually those two guys brought in the first, according to what I read, first telephone line between Washburn and Bismarck. Lewis became ill, and I believe it was cancer, but I'm not sure. But anyway, he ended up taking his own life, and he was only 40 years old. And after his death, my great-grandmother married Henry Tatley, which, interestingly enough, Henry Tatley started as a driver of one of those stages that drove the stagecoach from Bismarck to Washburn. And my guess is that's where he met Carolyn. So 2 years after that, they got married, and he eventually, and I think he bought the JP in 1897. Before that, he had, I don't know if he built it, but he might have managed. I know he was a manager, either built. It was called the Western Hotel. I always had to go to church on Sunday, and like any other kid about that age, I didn't want to get out of bed, and so I said, okay, I'll go to church, but it's got to be the 11 o'clock service. And of course, I needed a ride, and it was Trinity Lutheran Church down there. So my mother would drop me off, and I'd wave goodbye and walk front door, and then immediately scoot out the left door and then shoot down to the Bismarck Hotel, because between the Bismarck Hotel and the Grand Pacific Hotel was the GP newsstand. And I found out that the old Bismarck Hotel was actually the original Pacific Hotel that my great-grandfather had started. And those renovations, Henry Tatley had severed the old Pacific Hotel and left part of it for the Bismarck Hotel, and then the other part was actually moved across the street and became like First Warranty and Trust Bank for a while. So I would play the pinball machines, the pinball machine in the back. And then when church was about over, I'd scoot out and come in the side door. And my mother would be there to pick me up.
My dad, his dad died, I believe my brother Dave would give us a date, but I think it was about 1940. Both my dad and my uncle Vernon were going to school at that time, the Agricultural College in Fargo, now North Dakota State. And then they had to drop out of school to come back and run the hotel, which they knew nothing about, Mike, whatsoever. But they managed, and the hotel became kind of the center of the North Dakota oil industry in the 50s, and really helped. I mean, both my dad and my uncle were working 7 days a week and long hours at the time. My grandfather, Frank Hedden, was always in the real estate business, and much like my father, who, if a farmer came into town and just flat didn't have the money to stay at the GP Hotel, he would comp them and comp the family for the stay. My grandfather, who built many, many homes in Bismarck, most of them in the 1940s were tract homes, quite small. You still can see them if you drive in East Bismarck, and then later on at Highland Acres. But my grandfather would also provide for the homeowners, if they could not afford a washer or a dryer or other appliances, would buy it for them and say, well, pay me when you can. And I had, and I'm sure my other brothers have had the same experience. Both people come up to us and just say what wonderful parents or wonderful grandparents we had because of their generosity.
There's a story that I'll tell you about this one farmer near Pettibone, North Dakota. John and I went hunting there right after Thanksgiving when Dad called us, and there was a flight of northern ducks and geese down. He said, boys, you got to come out and hunt. So our wives gave us permission. We drove out late that day. And as we headed towards Pettibone, I said, John, you got to drive. And so he was driving on this gravel road. And of course, there wasn't anybody on the road. So he's driving fairly fast. And I fell asleep until we went flying off this little tiny hill, and the car came crashing down. And then all of a sudden you hear this grinding noise. And I said, crap, I think the oil pan's broke or something. And John says, no problem. No problem. See that farmer? There's a farm over there. We'll just go into his farmyard. One light lit, 3 a.m. in the morning, we pull in. And about 3 minutes later, the farmer comes out and says, boys, what's wrong? And I said, well, here's what happened. I think my oil pan shot. And he said, well, no problem. Let's take it in the barn. I got a hoist. Got it up in the hoist. Oil's dripping loose. He says, yep, that's it. I'm going to drain it. And I got a welder here. I'm going to fix it for you. So as he was doing all this work, I said, John, how much money do you got? We got to give this guy at least 20, 30 bucks or something like that. And so we scraped up some money, and he finally got it all fixed, got the car down. And so John went over to hand him the money. He said, you know, you don't owe me a thing. And that's what I remember about the Dakotas. There was such generosity among people. But then he looked at John, and then he looked at me, and he says, where do you come from? And we said, well, we live in Bismarck. And he said, you guys look familiar. Who's your dad? And he said, John Peterson. And this farmer said, I owe you this, because your dad has comped us multiple times when we come in to get school supplies for our kids. And so both Dad and Vernon were very generous with people having a very difficult time.
As far as the 50s and in the hotel with the oil guys, I remember Dad would always say what a wild time that was. I mean, there would be poker games downstairs at that time with $2,000 or $3,000 in the pot. And you said there was a time where these oil guys would be shaking dice for a Cadillac down there. And one time you mentioned that in the steakhouse or in the bar, one of these oil guys flipped over the placemat and did a lease that valued about almost $500,000 and had a notarized and everything on this placemat right in the GP. And then another time he reflected on this, one of these oil guys from Williston paid $175 and took a taxi from Williston to the Grand Pacific Hotel. That seemed to be the action spot, because I think it was the remodel, and it could have been after there was a fire in 54. And when he remodeled, he put in a piano bar, and there was a lot of action there. Not to say that there wasn't anything going on at the Peterson, but it seemed, like any other bar, the action was at a certain place, and it was there.
I had a chance with Dad when John and Dave and I went to town to plan how they wanted funerals and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, Dad, think back on the hotel. What is the most dangerous thing you had to do? And he said, that's an easy one for me. And I said, well, tell me the story. And he said, well, we were all asleep at home. I got a call at 3 a.m. in the morning from the front desk. And the front desk clerk said, John, you got to go up to room 205 because two guys got into an argument. One guy's got a pistol. You got to talk him down or call the police. So my dad went down to the hotel, went up to that room, knocked on the door, and they said, hey, I know you guys are arguing. This is John Peterson, owner of the hotel, and I just want to come in and talk to you guys. And so he walked in the room, and this one guy literally had the gun pointing at that other guy. And my dad said, what's up? And he said, well, he just cheated me in a poker game, and I wanted my money back, and he's not going to give it to me. And he said, well, why do you think he was cheating? And he said, well, he was dealing off the bottom of the deck for himself. And my dad asked this other guy, is that true? And he said, yes. I don't know why he said yes, but he said yes. And I said, my dad just said, you got to give him your money back. And he gave him the money back, and both guys, one guy parted out of the room, and one with a gun. And my dad said to him, he said, I don't want anybody talking about this story, because there are families, farmers and ranching families in this hotel. We need to keep everybody safe, including the oil men that are in this. I don't want anything like that to happen. We need to care for one another and respect the life of one another. but he said it was a scary moment for him.
Help tell the stories of Bismarck's past and become a financial sponsor of this program. Contact info@bismarckhistory.org to learn more.
It was during my time I was called the band bookie at the GP because I started getting local bands within Bismarck, and then I'd go to bands from Dickinson or Fargo or Minot to come down, etc. And then some would come from South Dakota and Minnesota. And then this one time I got a call from Detroit, and this is relating to the Supremes. Do you have any dates open? And this had to be back in '64 because that was my junior year of high school. And I said, yeah, I got this one date, and I got your name written down. And I said, we do have a cover charge such that, if there's any things that your band leaves, messy, et cetera, you just need to, pay $5 or something like that for us to clean it up. And I said, you're on. I got your date down. And the guy said, well, I got to tell you something. And I said, well, okay, what is it? He said, well, this group is a bunch of Negro women. And I said, well, that's okay. We don't have any in Bismarck. I mean, I have no idea about it. They'll be well received. And so the Supremes did come that night. And for the first hour before intermission, the place was packed, probably 150 people in the convention hall and in the Supremes, and nobody danced. They were so good, we just listened to their music. And the manager came over and said, Terry, why aren't the kids dancing? And I said, they're so good, they just want to listen. And he said, at break, you go tell your friends, they better start dancing or we're leaving. So I spread the word to guys, I spread the word to everybody. They the first song and everybody started dancing. So I mean, it was a fun time, but all I can say is for 3 years we had, unless it was during holidays like Christmas and Easter, we had bands at the GP Hotel unless there were conventions there.
I remember a Democratic convention, state Democratic convention, in which Ted Kennedy was part of that at the Hall of Four Seasons. This was 1972. And other notables, Theodore Roosevelt stayed at the GP Hotel back in the day. I remember in 1970, Bob Seger played. Terry mentioned the dances, but there were also some fantastic regional bands. The Fabulous Flippers out of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, played the Plain States mostly. They did play some in Minnesota. They could have made the Beatles blush. I mean, they were so good. And so, oh God, there's other big artists that just escape me, but it was in their early years that they performed there.
The GP Hotel was the center of the Republican organizing committee for 40 some years. And as far as I know, the organizing committee was started early on, I think, by Milt Young. And their mission was to weed out the NPL element from the Republican Party, which they thought were too moderate or a little too left-wing for their organization. So they had offices in the hotel for many, many years. And another organization was the Rotary Club, 42 years at In fact, that Ponderosa room, I think they might have met down there. I can remember when Nelson Rockefeller was running for president, or he was vice president at the time, I can't recall. But Dad was really excited because he they were going to auction off his tie, Rockefeller's tie. And Dad thought he was going to raise all this money for the Republican Party. At that time, he called them Eisenhower Republicans. Those were kind of good guys. They were probably moderate Democrats now, but so they had this auction, and he was, thought, man, got $50, and so they could raise off his tie. My dad was so dejected. He said, cheap so-and-so. And Bobby Kennedy spoke at the GP for some Native American conference there. And another interesting, my dad told me, do you remember when Oral Roberts used to come down and have those, he stayed at the hotel. And Dad said he was working the desk that night on a couple of occasions, and I think they'd have him down at the World War Memorial Building, I think, and they'd come back, and he said they'd have a suitcase full of cash. And so they'd come in, and he said they'd slap that down on the counter, and they'd count all the cash and put it in the safe at night. And then in the morning, he'd have to come down and they count the cash again. And I'm sure they reported all that to the IRS. William Howard Taft stayed at the GP, and William Jennings Bryan, but that's all I can remember right now. The hotel was really on life support at that time anyway because of Holiday Inn, the interstate up north, business had fallen off. Things were getting too expensive to replace. It was just modern times that just the time ran out for that hotel. So he was very of course sad because of the memories and things, but he was very pleased that urban renewal came in, and that was a godsend for them, really. And because he was racking his brain to pay everything for Gate City, and there was still a lot of bills. So this kind of took the pressure off him and released him. So it was very good for my dad and everybody else. My Uncle John Peterson too. My dad called it the wake, and it was part of it was held. He had at Fort Lincoln had a big barbecue one night, took everybody, sent out invitations, and had a big sandbar golf tournament with these, and a lot of these Texas oil guys came back from there, and then had a big banquet on, I think it was on the Saturday night, and they just had a wonderful reunion, just like any other reunion, visiting and things of that nature.
The success that my father and my grandfather had were due to generosity and long hours. Both of them worked. If you really want something, you've got to really want something where you can almost taste it. And success comes from working a structured life, and my dad and certainly my grandfather provided the structure necessary to be successful.
My dad, every morning that I got up, he'd be in the living room on his knees reading the Bible. And mom also said, what you got to do is you got to learn how to love God and then love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's what they did, and that's the environment in which we grew up. So our family is very blessed.
Help tell the stories of Bismarck's past and become a financial sponsor of this program. Contact info@bismarckhistory.org to learn more.
I asked Pa, I said, what do you think, Riverwood, Pa? Do you think that'd be a good name? So I submitted that name and I won it.
Remember when the Capitol burned, I looked out and there was this black stuff going by the window.
The president of Woolworth at the time's name was Kirkwood.
My parents decided, I think my mom decided, that Bismarck needed a zoo. So